In 1915, during World War I, Germany launched an attack on the Soviet Union, especially through the country of Latvia. Most of Latvia's territory was occupied by Germany, which resulted in local people being forced to flee to save themselves and reclaim their homeland. As a form of resistance, many Latvians volunteered to help the Soviets and were nicknamed Latvia the Riflemen. One morning, two brothers Edgar and Arthur rode a train home from Jelgava, Latvia. Arthur and Edgar were two brothers who were caught in the middle of the conflict, witnessing the cruelty of war that claimed the lives of their loved ones. When they arrived home while their father and Edgar were out, suddenly German soldiers came to look for spies from the Soviets. Because she was afraid that her son would be considered a spy, the mother panicked and immediately told Arthur to hide under the mattress while she would distract them. Luckily, when the German soldiers entered, Arthur was not caught. Outside, the German soldiers managed to find two men hiding in the warehouse when Arthur's mother tried to defend and explain that the two men were just ordinary citizens. The German soldiers instead thought that Arthur's mother was trying to fight the officers, so the German soldiers immediately shot her. Seeing his mother dead, Arthur was very shocked and immediately took the initiative to take his father's rifle. But when he wanted to shoot, the German soldiers had left. This incident left a deep trauma for Arthur, who vowed to avenge his mother's death. The next day, because the war between the Soviets and Germany was getting hotter, the villagers decided to evacuate to the capital, namely the city of Riga, which was located near the border between the Soviets. Before leaving the village, Arthur's father shot all the livestock so that they could not be used by the German army. After moving to the capital city of Riga, Arthur's father, together with other Latvian citizens, registered as volunteer soldiers to help the Soviets. The volunteers were nicknamed the Latvian Firing Squad. Unfortunately, Arthur's registration was rejected because he was only 17 years old, and his father was also too old. Hearing the rejection, Arthur's father asked the officer to give his registration documents to the commander. When the commander read the time, he found out that Arthur's father was a war veteran with the rank of sergeant. The commander immediately allowed him to join. The next day, the volunteers were taken to the Soviet military training camp. That morning, during the war simulation training process, instead of practicing seriously, Arthur and his friends joked around playing and shooting. Seeing the behavior of the two children as a war trainer, his father firmly punished them both by ordering them to stand on one leg. In the afternoon, while resting, suddenly a German plane passed by. 1 month later, after undergoing various training, the Latvian Rifle Squad was finally declared ready for battle. Arthur felt proud when he first wore a soldier's uniform. When the captain finished giving instructions, all the soldiers departed.
Hurrah! Hurrah!
Arriving at the battlefield, while taking shelter in the trench, so that the atmosphere was not tense, the soldiers joked and laughed together. But suddenly, there was an air bomb attack that shook. Many soldiers were injured, and Arthur had to face the bitter reality of a war full of risks and losses. In the midst of the panic, Arthur's father instructed the soldiers to prepare to attack. While waiting for the signal, Arthur was very afraid. The soldiers slowly advanced towards the German defenses, but because of the thick fog, they had difficulty seeing, and one by one the soldiers were shot by the enemy. When the German defense trenches began to appear, they all rushed to attack them. After being involved in the battle, Arthur was finally seriously injured and rushed to the hospital. Fortunately, he was still saved. There, he also received a letter from his father, who was fighting on the battlefield. The letter told of his father's struggle and hoped that they could be reunited. After reading the letter, a beautiful nurse named Martha passed by. Although her attitude was unfriendly, when Arthur saw Martha's beauty, he immediately fell in love at first sight. 1 month later, Edgar, who had now been promoted to lieutenant, came to visit. Edgar came there to encourage Arthur and tell him that his father was fine. The Latvian shooting squad also continued to win until they managed to beat back the German soldiers. Hearing the good news, Arthur felt relieved. When he had fully recovered, before going to war again, Arthur dared to ask Martha to get to know him. Although Martha's attitude was rude at first, she eventually gave in and Arthur was happy to see this. The next morning, when he returned to the battlefield, German soldiers were seen using their prisoners of war as bait. Seeing this cunning tactic, the Latvian shooting squad was annoyed because the distance to the German army trench was only about 50 meters. Both sides shouted insults at each other. In the middle of the argument, Arthur secretly approached his father, who was a sniper. When he found out his son had come without a disguise, his father immediately smeared Arthur with dirt, then taught him how to be a sniper. However, when his father told him to shoot the German prisoners, Arthur felt hesitant. His father was also disappointed with his son's cowardly attitude. During the day, the war continued because the Germans used a lot of tear gas, and the Latvian shooting squad was overwhelmed and forced to retreat. The next morning, when they returned to the battlefield, in the trench the commander asked where Arthur's father was. He had been spying on the German troops for an hour, but had not returned yet. Worried, Arthur rushed to find his father. After successfully finding him, it turned out that his father had died. Arthur's father's death was a dramatic moment that changed everything. When buried, Arthur buried his father's rifle as a tribute. 1 year later, when winter arrived, Lieutenant Edgar was seen announcing that from now on, soldiers from Siberia would join them. Edgar then asked several soldiers to volunteer to advance to the front line to open the way into the German defense fort. Without thinking long, Arthur volunteered. After giving instructions, Edgar disbanded the ranks. In the afternoon, when everyone was resting, Edgar approached Arthur and asked why he wanted to volunteer earlier, even though Edgar planned to put his brother in the back row to be safer. Arthur casually replied, wasn't his job just to open the path? As long as he didn't get shot, he would survive. Because he was worried, Edgar decided to accompany them to the front lines. In the night when the attack began, Arthur, Edgar, and other volunteer soldiers secretly infiltrated and cut the barbed wire of the German defense. After successfully opening the way, the soldiers slowly began to crawl forward. Initially, all plans went smoothly. However, when they wanted to detonate the bomb, they were discovered. The Latvian shooting squad won. They all celebrated by cooking food together. While eating, there was a soldier who read a letter from his mother to one of the soldiers who had died in the attack. Hearing the contents of the letter, everyone fell silent, sadly. A letter that could never be answered. While contemplating, suddenly, the commander received an order to immediately retreat to headquarters. In the morning, in the middle of the journey, German troops suddenly appeared to block them. Everyone took cover while trying to contact headquarters for help. But the headquarters easily refused to help. Hearing the refusal, the commander was disappointed. Like it or not, they all had to survive until night. As an older brother, Edgar tried to calm Arthur so that they would survive. However, the bitter reality appeared when his older brother died before his eyes. After successfully returning to the base, Arthur sadly handed over Edgar's badge to the commander. Now Arthur was alone without a family. Not long after, there was a commotion between the Latvian soldiers and the headquarters officers. The Latvian soldiers felt betrayed because the help they expected from the base was rejected. In the midst of the commotion, everyone was shocked when one of the soldiers read a piece of paper from the Soviet rebel revolutionary troops. In the sheet, the revolutionary troops said that the Soviets were only using Latvian citizens to fight against Germany, so the Soviet army did not need to bother sacrificing its soldiers. The Germans, who had always been considered the real enemy, were helping to liberate their land from the Soviets. After reading the newspaper, the Latvian soldiers began to hesitate about which side to support. Soviet or German? Neither of them could be trusted. 2 months passed at the base while everyone was taking a shower. Suddenly, the commander ordered them to gather with weapons. When they gathered, Arthur was shocked. They were told to execute their comrades who were caught betraying because they defended the revolutionary troops. Arthur was in a dilemma. Seeing Arthur's attitude, Even though the commander knew this was difficult, they had to follow orders from the Soviets. The commander firmly reminded him that if you don't shoot, you will be the one shot by the Soviet army. Hearing that, Arthur was even more in a dilemma, until finally Arthur chose not to shoot. Because he went against orders, Arthur was arrested. That night, without the knowledge of the Soviet soldiers, his friends secretly freed Arthur. When he met the commander, Arthur immediately hit him. Why did the commander side with the Soviets more than his soldiers? This disappointment prompted Arthur to leave the base with his friend. During the trip, his friend explained that the Latvian government was forming a national army from former shooting squads in the city of Cesis. Moved by this idea, Arthur decided to join. In the middle of the trip, they had to run to save themselves from the Soviet soldiers, but unfortunately, his friend was shot and killed. With an injured condition, Arthur was forced to run alone. When he came out of the forest, Arthur accidentally met Martha. At the same time, Soviet soldiers passed by. Arthur immediately hid. Fortunately, when interrogated by Soviet soldiers, Martha pretended not to see anything. When the situation was safe, Martha treated Arthur's wounds in the river. After being treated, Arthur did not forget his friend. He and Martha buried his friend's body. The next morning, after his wounds had healed, before leaving, he gave Martha a ring and promised to marry her after the war was over. Upon arrival in the city of Cesis, many residents enthusiastically registered to become nationalist troops. Arthur also registered. Because he was experienced, Arthur was immediately made a sergeant to lead the young soldiers. 1 week after undergoing various military training, the young soldiers led by Arthur were given a mission to block the German army and protect the railway bridge. In the midst of the war, the young soldiers looked panicked, just like he was when he first joined the war. One by one, they were shot dead. Seeing his soldiers trembling with fear, even though his position was dangerous, Arthur stood up to encourage them. Arthur then gave the command and said, "Our struggle is still long, very long, but we must continue to fight until Latvia is independent." During the First World War, the population of Latvia was halved by more than 1.2 million souls. After World War I ended, Latvia achieved independence. But when World War II broke, Latvia was recolonized by Germany and the Soviet Union and became independent again in 1991. In the midst of war's chaos, only tears and sorrow remain, bearing silent witness to the unhealed destruction and loss. What do you think? Please put your comment below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks.